Hey everyone, and welcome to this new tutorial series here on Avid Blogs focusing on getting started fast with Avid for Final Cut Pro 7 editors. My name is Kevin P. McAuliffe, and in this first lesson we're going to talk about two very important things that you're going to need to know once you make the switch from Final Cut Pro 7 to Avid Media Composer. The first thing you're going to need to understand is AMA and exactly how it works and how you're going to want to set it up inside of Media Composer 7. On the surface, AMA looks like it's something similar to basic importing inside of Final Cut Pro 7, but believe it or not, it actually goes way more in depth than just a simple import. And in the second part of the lesson, I'm going to show you how simple it is using the power of AMA linking to get your Final Cut Pro 7 timeline into Avid Media Composer 7 lightning quick. Now, one thing I do want to mention before we move on is that in the ongoing tutorials, we're actually going to have Final Cut Pro 7 open during a lot of the tutorials so you can see how things were done in the past in Final Cut Pro 7 and how you're going to be moving ahead into the future with Avid Media Composer. It's going to be really cool to switch back and forth, and I can show you really the intricate details as to how you used to do things in Final Cut Pro 7 and how you're going to do things now. You know what? And why don't I give you a little sample of how you used to do something and how you're going to do it now. Here's how you used to import inside of Final Cut Pro 7. What you're going to simply do is right-click, say Import, Save Files. All you're going to do now is simply navigate to a folder that you know has media on it. What we're going to do is we're going to come into footage. I'm just simply going to come into my elephants footage right here. I can simply select all the clips that I want, say choose, and there they are, ready to drop into any timeline you might be working on. Just that simple. Okay, so now how do we do the same technique inside of Avid Media Composer? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to hide Final Cut Pro 7. We're going to Command and Tab into Avid Media Composer, obviously Alt and Tab for all of my Windows friends out there. What we're going to do is simply create a new bin. I'm going to right click, I'm going to say AMA link. What we're going to do is we're going to choose the exact same footage. I'm simply going to select it all and say open, and you'll see that in a matter of seconds I have that same elephant footage right here, ready to take and drop into any timeline that I happen to be working on. So you'll see at its absolute most basic, the quote-unquote import process from Final Cut Pro 7 is almost the same as the AMA link to inside of Avid Media Composer. Now I say almost because, like I said, at its most basic, I'll say that they're similar. There's actually a whole lot more that's going on underneath the hood of AMA that you don't even see that's happening here that we're going to get to in just a second. Now, before we move on, there is something that I do want to mention about AMA linking to before we even get started. What you're going to want to do once you've made your Media Composer purchase and you've downloaded the software, you're going to want to launch your browser and you're going to head on over to avid.com/AMA. Now, in case you're not familiar with what exactly Media Access is it's a revolutionary plugin architecture that's going to greatly accelerate your tapeless video workflow. Now with AMA, what you're going to be able to do is you're basically going to be able to connect a card or disk or a device, and you're going to be able to begin editing with that footage right away. Now, how is that different from how you worked inside of Final Cut Pro 7? Well, you'll remember inside of Final Cut Pro 7 with the old log and transfer tool, what you had to do is if you plugged in, let's just say, an Xdcam camera, what would happen is inside the log and transfer tool, you could go through and take a look at all the footage, but you'd actually have to transcode that footage onto your hard drive first before you could start editing with it. With the power of AMA, you actually don't even need to do that. If you're on a tight deadline, you could simply plug in your card or disk or even a device and start editing instantly. Now, depending on the type of files that you're going to be working with, whether it's Alexa, whether it's AVC HD, Canon, Ikegami, Sony, Panasonic, it doesn't really matter. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to head on over to this website and you're going to want to download the different plugins for the different AMA file types. Now, what's important to keep in mind, you'll see right down here is that we have one for QuickTime, but the great thing is that you actually already have direct access without transcoding or rewrapping of QuickTime files, including ProRes on both Mac and Windows, instantly when you've installed Media Composer. You don't need anything extra to work with different types of QuickTime files. But like I said, depending on the type of files you're going to be working with, whether it's RED or any of the other formats, you're going to want to make sure you download these plugins and have them on your system before you start working. Now, once you have the plugins downloaded and installed, there's a couple things you're going to want to set up inside of Avid Media Composer. So let's Command Tab into Media Composer 7, and what I want to do is I want to head on over to the Settings tab. Now, you'll remember the Settings tab from one of the first lessons we did in the original Get Started Fast with Avid Media Composer tutorial series. What I'm going to do is head on over to Settings, and appropriately enough, you're going to notice the very first setting that we have in there, of course, because they do come in alphabetical order, but also why not put the most important one first? We're going to talk about the AMA setting. I'm simply going to double click on it. Now, the very first thing you're going to see is the bin setup. Now, what does this mean? What this basically means is, what is Media Composer going to do when it sees a volume that's attached that it knows is an AMA link to volume? Well, it could use the active bin, whatever bin's open. It could, in most cases, create a new bin. Now, by creating a new bin, do you want the default bin naming convention? Do you want to use the volume name? Or do you want to specify a bin name? In most cases, I just leave the volume name, because in most cases, I can take a look at my bins in my project and say, okay, yeah, I know that all the ones that came from Xdcam are all called, Xdcam 001, Xdcam 002, etc., etc., etc. And you'll see down here at the bottom, we can also display imported head frame or display editor head frame. Now, the next option we have is for quality. You'll see inside of quality, the AMA link preference is for video and audio right now to be the highest quality. You'll see down here, as far as the consolidate transcode relink preference, the video and audio is also set to the highest quality. Obviously, you can get in and adjust this however you need to. Now, volume mounting. Now, for the first two options, you'll see that we're talking about legacy. We're talking about legacy P2 and legacy Xdcam imports. So obviously, if you're using some older P2 or Xdcam technology, you're going to want to make sure that you checkmark one of these boxes depending on which you happen to be using. Now, you'll see that you can also automatically AMA link to volumes, so Media Composer 7 will automatically mount them, and it will set things up with the way that you have your bins set up and your quality as soon as it sees a new drive that it knows that it can link to. And last but certainly not least, you'll see that we can, when mounting previously mounted volumes, we don't need to check for modifications to the volume. So basically meaning, let's say you had an Xdcam drive that you had attached that had something that you shot some footage on, Media Composer is just going to remount that, and it's not going to check for anything modified, because guess what? You shot on that. Chances are you haven't done anything to modify anything that's going to be on that disk. Now, the last option that we have here is the link options. Now, inside of link options, we have our multi-channel audio. How do you want Media Composer to handle multi-channel audio? Do you want it to import them as mono, audio 1, audio 2, or do you want them to import it as a stereo pair? What you can also do is tell Media Composer, do you want to have your broadcast wave files as the project rate, or maybe you want them all as a specific frame rate? Now, in most cases, you're going to leave that as the project frame rate. Now, last but certainly not least, and a big and important one, is that now inside of version 7 with AMA linking to clips that have alpha channels, that's all supported in the AMA importing process. So you'll see that in here you can tell Media Composer whether you want the alpha channel to be inverted, do not invert and have it black as opaque, or just ignore it altogether. In most cases, you're going to leave it as the default, do not invert, black equals opaque. Now, once you have everything set up in here, you're going to be ready to do some AMA linking to. And to AMA link to a volume, in this case, I'm going to link to a folder, but you're going to see how the process works, because it works very similar. To AMA link to, in this case, a folder is very simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate up to File, and I'm simply going to come down to AMA link. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to a folder that I have inside of my footage folder on my Mac drive. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick one that I know has some HDV footage that I originally captured inside of Final Cut Pro 7, and it's my Elephants folder. All I'm going to do is simply select it, and I'm going to come right down here and I'm going to say Open. Now, of course, what's important to keep in mind is that based on the file type that you're importing, you can have Media Composer only show you specific file types, but for me, I want it to auto-detect any AMA available file that it has in here. That's why I'm going to leave that as auto-detect AMA plugin. I'm simply going to come down and say Open. You'll see that literally in a matter of seconds, I now have this footage inside my bin, and you can see that I have the icon of a master clip with a little, what looks like a little chain link right beside it, signifying to me that these clips are all AMA linked to. Now, I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Kev, why does this footage look stretched? What is going on with it? what's actually going on with it is this footage is actually HD and I'm in an SD project. Now, there's a reason why I'm actually doing this particular workflow, and you're going to see why in just a second. Now, what I think I'm going to do here, now what's important to keep in mind, you'll also see, is that when I imported this, it tagged this as coming from the Mac drive because that is the volume that it did come from. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to import something else. So let's actually come back up to File. We're going to come down to AMA Link, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to import the basketball folder. I'm simply going to say Open. Now, I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Kev, what's going on here? Why did it import those clips into the same bin? Because inside of your AMA settings, you had it set up to create a new bin based on the volume name. Oh, well, what's important to keep in mind is that technically all these clips came from the same volume. They all came from the Mac drive. That's why I put all the clips into the same bin. Now, this was really the footage that I wanted to use only because the Elephants is HDV and the quality is not that great, because HDV is a very compressed format. Now, I know you're probably also thinking to yourself, well, Kev, you know what? That's really no different than what we've done inside of Final Cut Pro in the past. We've basically just right-click, we say import, we say files, and in this case, there's the Elephants right there. I can simply select them and say go, and there's really all the clips that I have ready to work with, you know, really at the click of a mouse. So how is AMA any different? Well, obviously one of the main features of AMA is the fact that you don't even need to transcode any footage that's coming from a camera. So for example, an AVC HD camera, you don't need to transcode any of that footage to start working with it. You could simply plug in and start editing. Now, another fantastic feature of AMA is that we actually have some hidden things under the hood that if you're not paying attention to, you're going to miss. What I'm going to do is I'm simply going to hide Final Cut Pro 7, and as you can see, we're back in Avid Media Composer. Now, a couple things that I want to do before we move on. First thing is that we're working on a standard definition project right now. I think what I'm going to do, I think I'm just going to switch over to an HD project because I want to show you something very cool in just a second. Now, the other thing that I need to do is I need to import some more media. Now, by switching the project back to be 1920 by 1080, we're obviously at a high definition frame size, 1920 by 1080. But here's the thing, and here's the beauty of how AMA works, and really what you're going to see in just a second is the power of frame flex. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the Mac drive, I'm going to come to my footage, and I'm going to come into the 3K cloud chambers. These are some elements from Rampant Design Tools, and I'll just pick one of them here, just double click on it. So you can see we have a ridiculously large frame size. And you can see actually right here in the inspector that the frame size is actually 3072 pixels wide by 1536 pixels high. Well, that is a lot bigger than our 1920 by 1080 frame. So in most cases, what would happen when you imported this clip is that the clip would get crushed down to be 1920 by 1080 to fill that frame. But not with the power of frame flex. Let me show you what I mean by that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to Command and Tab back into Media Composer, Alt and Tab obviously from my Windows friends. Let's actually just hide QuickTime here because I don't need to see that. And what we're going to do is we're going to AMA link to those clips. So let's come right down here to the bottom to AMA link to. And I just need to make sure that I actually don't have anything selected. I'll right click, there we go, AMA link. And let's come to our 3K cloud chambers. I'm simply going to select all the clips and I'm going to say open. They're going to appear in my bin right there, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of them. I'm going to double click on it, and you can see there is that footage. But here's the thing, I know that this footage is a lot larger than this frame size. So how do I get in and adjust the frame? Well, it's actually very simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate over to the first clip. Now, obviously, I'm going to show this to you on the first clip, but the process works the same with every AMA clip that you link to. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to come right down here to source settings. Now inside the source settings, it automatically defaults to the color encoding, but we're actually going to jump over here to the left to the AMA source settings, where you can actually get in and be very specific about what is going on with this clip, the field order and the field layout, etc., etc. But where is most important for what we're going to be doing is actually the next two tabs. The first one being color encoding. Now, obviously, depending on the type of footage that you're working with, you can actually get in and tell Media Composer what the source color space is, whether it's Alexa, whether it's 709 gamma full range, whether it's Canon C-Log, Sony. And this is the great thing about right-clicking on these clips and getting in here to the source settings. You can actually, like I said, be very specific to make sure that your footage looks exactly the way that it should once you get it in here. Now, most important for us is the next tab, that being FrameFlex. And as you can see, FrameFlex has already figured out that the raster dimensions of this clip is 3072 pixels by 1536 pixels. The image aspect ratio is 2:1 and the pixel aspect ratio is 1:1. But for us, what's most important is right down here, the FrameFlex window. Now, remember, we're dealing with a 16:9 frame. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to change our frame aspect ratio to be, of course, 16:9. Now, as soon as I do that, you're going to see that things have changed a little bit. We now actually have a visual representation of a 16:9 frame. Now, you'll see that if I switch back here for just a second, as I'm switching between the frame aspect ratios, the preview window is updating down here at the bottom. So let's switch back to 16:9. Now, what's cool about this is we can actually take the frame now and move it like such, or move it like such, and you'll see again we have the update down here. But what is very cool about this, remember, we're dealing with a frame that's 3000 pixels wide by 1500 pixels high. So that's actually way bigger than our 1920 by 1080 frame size, meaning that I can actually zoom in on certain parts of the frame to then take this cloud chamber and zoom right in on it to give us a very different look, a very close-up look at a clip that we might not normally be able to see this close up. Now, if I want to actually apply this to the clip, all I need to do now is simply say apply, and you'll see that as soon as I do that, it immediately updates in the preview window. Now, let's just talk about a couple other things here before we get out of this window. So, you'll see we talked about frame aspect ratio 16:9. We have the X and Y values. Obviously, I was adjusting the X and Y values by simply grabbing on the FrameFlex box and dragging it around, but we can do it the old-fashioned way as well if we wanted to. You'll see we can adjust the size as well. We can have the size match the project raster if we wanted to, and of course we can reset everything, as well as getting in and being able to reformat by stretching pillar box, letterbox, center crop, or center keep size. This is actually very cool if you're dealing with 4:3 pan and scan images. So 16:9 frame sizes inside of 4:3 frames for standard definition. You can actually get in and do center crops right here in the FrameFlex window. So since I'd already applied this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel out of that and take a look at what this looks like now. Looks very cool. Now I'm just going to bump the quality up to be full quality. There we go. Looking very nice. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this clip and we're going to drop it into our timeline. But I've just realized something. I actually don't want this to be like that. I actually want this to be halfway off the frame. Oh, you know what? So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to come back over here. I'm going to have to right click and go back in. No I don't. Because what I can now do is simply step into effects mode. Now my shortcut for effects mode is Shift and Y on the keyboard. If you don't happen to have it mapped, no problem. You can simply find it right over here in the composer window or right down here in the timeline window. Now you're going to notice right away as soon as I go into effects mode, take a look at that. There's my FrameFlex box. Well, I wonder if I actually take the box and grab it and move it, is that going to update as soon as I step out of the clip? Well, yes, it absolutely is. So if I step back in now and decide that I actually only want this to be halfway on the frame, all I need to do is simply adjust it so that it's sitting halfway off the frame. And as soon as I step out, guess what? I now only see part of that image in the frame. So you see, with FrameFlex, you now have control of your image that you never had in the past. It's a powerful tool that I guarantee you're going to be using all the time with frames that are larger than the frame size that you're currently working on in your project. And you know, since I did tease it, and there are a lot of people working in standard definition out there, don't forget, you can always simply come back over to 30i NTSC. We can actually just delete this footage now. We'll just delete it here. 5 master clips, 1 sequence. You'll see that I can come into an HD clip. Again, I can simply come to it. I can simply right click. I can come down to source settings. We can come back over to FrameFlex. And remember, we can set the frame aspect to be 4:3 like I just said. And we can actually have this center crop to have a pan and scan image going on inside our standard definition project. Very, very cool. Now I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well Kev, how does moving my project from Final Cut Pro 7 over to Media Composer 7, how is AMA involved in all that? Well, let me show you how simple this is. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to Command Tab back into Final Cut Pro. Now to do what I'm going to show you right now, you're going to need a free utility. You're going to head on over to automaticduck.com. automaticduck.com, and you're going to download Pro Export for Final Cut Pro. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that Automatic Duck is at the end of life, meaning it's not being developed anymore, so we pretty much have to take it as we see it. There'll be no more updates for this software. But that's okay, because the software works pretty darn good, let me tell you. Well, you know what? Let me show you. I have a timeline here that I want to take from Final Cut, and I want to move it to Media Composer. Now you'll see we have a few things in here that you might find typically in a project, and what I think I'm also going to do here, just for kicks, is I'm just going to lower my audio levels, because my audio levels are way too high. So let's just lower my audio levels here, because I want to show you how almost everything in this timeline transfers over into Media Composer. And what doesn't, we're actually going to be told what doesn't transfer over. Okay, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to save this project. I'm going to navigate up to File. I'm going to come down to Export, and once installed, you'll find Automatic Duck Pro Export for Final Cut Pro located right here. What you want to do is you want to export it as an AAF file. What you're going to do is you're going to come into the Edit Settings. Now what's important to keep in mind here is that what we want to do is we want to prepare export for AMA Relink. Now as soon as I do that, you're going to notice pretty much everything else has now become unselectable, except of course for the project type. Now because this is HDV footage, I do want to go to a 1080i 5994 project. Otherwise, we're pretty much all set to go. What we're going to do is we're going to call this, appropriately enough, my FCP project. And I'm simply going to say save. Now you're going to see that in a matter of seconds, I now have a new window that pops up that says that the sequence contained one or more unsupported effects. So of course the big question is, what is not supported? Well, let's find out. What I'm going to do is we're just going to head to the Mac drive. We're going to head down to my FCP junk, appropriately enough, right here, FCP junk. And inside of here, I now have not only the AAF file, but I now have a .html file that I can simply double click on. And what's going to happen now is I'm going to be brought to an HTML document that's going to tell me exactly what is not supported in the AAF file that I just exported. And you'll see it's something as simple as a drop shadow, but that's fine. I can add the drop shadow back to the text when we get into Media Composer. Okay, so let's just do that. Let's come back into Media Composer, and what I need to do is I need to switch over to a 1080i project. Well, I actually don't. All I need to do is inside of this standard definition project, I can actually switch the format because we're dealing with like frame rates to be a 1080i project. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete everything that's in this bin. Now what's important to keep in mind is that I'm only deleting the AMA Link 2 clips. We're not deleting any media from my drive. And let's just close everything in the background here. There we go. And what I'm going to do is simply right click and I'm going to say import. What I need to do now is to simply navigate to that FCP junk folder. We're going to come to that AAF file and I'm simply going to say open. You'll see that in a matter of seconds, if I double click on it, you'll see that I'm prompted and told that the effects need to be upgraded to advanced keyframe effects, which is fine. I could say don't ask again when loading a sequence. I'm simply going to say okay and take a look at that. That sequence looks pretty close to what I have inside of Final Cut. Very cool. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this title back. Now in most cases you could do that one of two ways. You could simply select all of the titles that you happen to have in a particular timeline. Let's just simply come back to the beginning here. We'll mark an in point, mark an out point. What you could do is you could come up to clip and you could simply come down to recreate title media. What will happen then is Media Composer will go through every title in your timeline and create new media from it. Now, I'm not going to have it do that because I know something. I know something that's going on here. What happens is that all of the title information transfers over. Now you're going to see that it doesn't recognize this font even though that I know it's on my system. So let's just find that font. It's right down here. We'll just choose the medium version of it, which is fine. I'll simply say okay. Now you'll see that it remembers the title. It just doesn't remember where it was. But just the fact that it remembered everything is pretty impressive, let me tell you. Okay, so I'm just going to adjust this slightly here. I think it's fine to leave it at the top because we have our footage moving across the bottom of the screen, so we're just simply going to close this. I'll say save. Now for this, it's going to create a new piece of media, and there it is right there. Okay, so now the big question is, how do I relink this footage to those clips? Well, this is where AMA comes into everything. What you're going to need to do inside of Final Cut Pro before you do this process is you're going to need to move everything into the same bin. You can do that simply by selecting your sequence, navigating up to File, coming down to Media Manager, and inside here you want to take media and either copy it or move it into one single solitary folder. Now in this case, because I know that all this footage came from the same place, I didn't need to do that. So what I'm going to do is simply Command Tab. Actually, let's hide Final Cut here just so I can't see it. There we go. Very nice. I know all this footage is located in the same place, so what am I going to do? I'm going to come up to File. I'm going to come down to AMA Link. I'm going to navigate back to the footage folder to those elephants, and I'm going to AMA Link to that folder. And you'll see, of course, that it's AMA linked to those clips and stuck them in the same Mac drive volume, which is perfectly fine for what we're doing. The only thing that's important is that Media Composer sees those clips and knows where they're located on my hard drive. Now all I need to do is to simply select the clips in the bin that I want to relink, which is these ones right here. We're going to navigate up to Clip, and I'm going to come down to Relink. Now this looks very confusing and very daunting, but it's actually very simple to navigate your way through this. What we want to do is we want to relink selected items to Media on Drive. We'll select all available drives. And what I want to make sure that I deselect is to relink only to media from the current project. Now believe it or not, the only other thing that we have to set in here is one simple but very important thing. Right down here under Relink by where it says Original, the time code is going to be the start, but what's important is that the source name is not the tape name or source ID, it's the tape name or source file name. That's very important. All I'm going to do now is simply say OK, and literally in a matter of seconds, all of my footage has been relinked and is now ready to come through, and simply hit play. And there we go. Now, of course, I don't have the drop shadow on my text, and that's fine. I could simply add that inside of the title tool, but you'll see what it's done is it's actually brought in not only the text, but it's brought in that effect that I had of the footage moving across the screen. And to do that effect, it's applied a simple picture-in-picture effect. Well, the best part is that I can simply come into that effect and promote it to a 3D warp tool if I wanted to. And you'll even see that if I come into the audio tool, if I hit F3, which is my shortcut for the audio tool, it even remembered the volume levels that I had set inside of Final Cut Pro 7. So I hope this tutorial has shown you what an integral part of your workflow AMA linking to is, not only just to get started working inside of Media Composer 7, but also to bring all of those old Final Cut Pro 7 projects back over to Media Composer that you might need to keep those clients nice and happy sitting beside you in the edit suite. So if you want to get post-production workflow tutorials and industry insight you need to bring great stories to life, head on over and check us out at avidblogs.com/post.